Hello, everybody. My name is Barry Johns, and welcome back to another edition of Studio Talk. Today, I'm going to give you my overall thoughts and my overall recommendations on if you should buy an M1, an M1 Pro, an M1 Max, or an M1 Ultra. Let's get to it. All right. So I've done a lot of tests on my channel on both the M1, the M1 Pro, and the M1 Ultra. Unfortunately, I don't have an M1 Max, but I've done my research on that, comparing it to between its spot and where it lays between the Pro and the Ultra. Okay, so lately I've done 3 different videos on the M1 Ultra showing it in Pro Tools with unsupported DAW and unsupported plugins, as well as next up was a fully supported DAW and maxed out virtual instruments, all of which were M1 Silicon native. Okay, and then lastly, one where I did a bunch of heavy automation and heavy plugin usage, all within Apple M1 native applications and M1 native plugins. Okay, so I've kind of shown all that on the Ultra. I've also got videos out there demonstrating basically the same on the M1 Pro. And then all of my tests on the M1 Mac, it was a MacBook Air as an example, that was early on. So that was still going through a lot of the stages, but it still clearly showed how powerful it was when it first came out. Okay. Bottom line is, if you're a Mac user, you are definitely at some point going to transition to Apple Silicon. There's no question about it. If you're a Windows user and you hate Mac, quit watching this video. Go watch something else. I mean, I got nothing against Windows. I promise you that. You can do great work with a Windows machine, but today we're talking about the Mac, okay? So I've said this in a couple of my videos. From everything I've watched from watching Max Tech, I highly recommend you watch those guys right there. Here's a video. There's a video on this right here, kind of showing you who they are. I strongly encourage you to go back and watch all of their M1 Pro, M1 Max, and M1 Ultra videos. They are worth the time. They come at it from every angle, okay? Now, when they do it, they're talking overall performance across, and they do all kinds of benchmarks in Logic and Final Cut Pro, as well as DaVinci Resolve and Premiere Pro. Okay, so they do a lot of tests out there on that. Now, the thing that we've got to consider, those of us been doing DAW work for some time, the general rule of thumb, or the thing that most people seem to understand or realize, is it's really more about the single core processor, not the multi-core processor, as far as benchmarking. You know, you will find out there that multi-core processing has a huge play on many apps out there, especially video editing, okay? And that's where you're going to get a lot of benefit out of there, as well as the GPU integration within the Apple Silicon platform or ecosystem, however you want to consider it. And so ultimately across the board, when it comes to DAW work, it's more centralized on that single core. Now, I have proven that not all single core scores are equal, okay? Because if you look at the M1, okay, and I'll bring that up on the video here and show you the exact scores, because I'm going to do that after this, okay? So here's the scores on the M1 right here, okay? Here's a single score and multi-score for the M1 Pro. Now here's the scores for the Apple Max. I couldn't remember the Max, okay? And then here's the scores for Silicon, and there's all of them together. Probably should have done that at the beginning, but now you can see there's not a heck of a lot of difference in the single core, okay? But yet I did find that even though the single core is marginally increased as you go up between the M1, M1 Pro, M1 Max, and M1 Ultra, okay, there's not a huge difference. Where there is in multi-core, there's a big difference, okay, in that aspect of things. But in the single core, not so much. So those of you who are out there thinking traditionally, and maybe this was the case on Intel processors before, but it's not proving to be the case with Apple Silicon, you are getting an increased percentage of performance in single core, between, as an example, between the Max and the Ultra, between the Pro and the Ultra, you're seeing an increase. Even though the single core scores are not that different, you are seeing it increase, but you're not seeing a substantial increase like you should compared to the cost. So today I have an M1 Mac Mini that I use at work, okay? And so I use that day in and day out, and it does everything I need it to and will not even possibly give me an issue at work for probably a decade or more, okay? It's plenty powerful for what you get. And then again, I'm not doing all this stuff at work. I'm doing work stuff, okay? What most of you do in your day in, day out jobs if you work on a computer at work, okay? Now, I also have an M1 Pro MacBook Pro, okay? Now, that's happening, sitting back there. It's on the little sleeve over there, sitting back there. And that's what I'm sticking with, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I'm sticking with. The M1 Ultra, okay? I'm going to be returning that. I'm going to be returning that. So overall, my general feelings are that if you're a bedroom warrior, you don't do a ton of virtual instruments, you primarily work in audio, maybe a little Superior Drummer, maybe a Tune Track, Easy Bass, and maybe Easy Drummer. They just came out Easy Drummer 3. And so, or whether it's Slate Digital, Slate Drums, whatever. If you're using that for your drums, maybe a few virtual instruments here or there, you're fine with an M1 MacBook Air or M1 Mac Mini. Now, M2 is right around the corner, so keep that in mind. However, there's a shortage of chips around here, so I think that may be delayed. So if I'm going to buy, normally I'd tell you to hold off. Right now, I'm not so sure I'd do that, okay? But I think you're going to be fine with that, okay? I think if you're going with the M1 MacBook Air or M1 Mac Mini, I would not waste my time with the M1 MacBook Pro. No way, no way, no way. Not enough in there to justify the increase in cost, okay? So I would not do that. Okay? So I do the Mac Mini or the MacBook Air. Now, if I'm going with either one of those, okay, I'm going to bump it up to 16 gigabyte of RAM. You can do a lot with 8 gigabyte of RAM. Believe it or not, you can do a lot with 8 gigabyte of RAM because RAM does not work the way it traditionally has, the way we're used to, okay? It just doesn't. The general rule of thumb with Apple Silicon, if you think you need 32 gig of RAM, then get half that, get 16. If you think you need 16, then get 8, okay? So I'm just telling you that, as well as the integration between the CPU, the RAM, and the GPU all kind of flowing back and forth and kind of working, coexisting within each other and sharing resources within each other. You can do a lot with a lot less these days, okay? So I would go for 16 gigabyte of RAM because not that you necessarily need it today, but you don't know what you're going to need down the road. And a computer for most of us is a long-term investment. I tend to get 8 to 10 years out of a computer when I buy it. Historically, that's been the case, all right? And so that's why you want to kind of try to get it as much as you can for what you can afford at that time. As far as hard drive space, do not even consider that 256. I'm going to tell you, 512 is the bare freaking minimum. Under no circumstances, buy an Apple Silicon Mac if you're going to, without anything less than a 512, okay? Now, I've got a 1 terabyte system drive in my MacBook Pro, my 16-inch MacBook Pro, M1 Pro. I've got a 1 terabyte in that, and I'm constantly kind of battling it, okay? So, but on those, get a 500 gigabyte minimum. Go up to 1 terabyte if you can, and then you can supplement that with external drives to do anything else you need to do. You can put your samples, your audio library, all those things on a separate drive. Now, the difference between Apple Silicon and previous things, historically, you've always wanted to keep your samples and do your sessions on a separate drive, but to free up the speed of the internal drive, that's gone. That's gone. If you want to be able to work with all of that in one while you're working with it, then crank up that internal drive. Once you're finished with that project, you can move that over to a slower, more efficient, and less expensive external drive, okay? So you may want to consider this. So those are some of the things that you can do to work around it, okay? Now, with Apple Silicon, you can, if you need to or you want to, you can actually do your operating system on an external. You could buy an external SSD enclosure, or not SSD, but M2, NMVE, or however you say that. I've got 2 of them back there. You can buy a Thunderbolt 4 or Thunderbolt 3 version of that, and you actually run your operating system, run it just fine. That's an option for you if you want want. If you can't afford, these are things, workarounds, that if you can't afford to bump up that hard drive, you can do. But if you can swing the money now, spend the money now, okay? More hard drive, a little bit more memory will pay off dividends in the long run, I promise you. Next up, if you do some moderately heavily virtual instruments, if you do moderate virtual instruments, I would say not heavy. If you do moderate virtual instruments and fairly large sessions with heavy plug-in loads, and I'm going to say a fairly large session in my book is 40 to 60 tracks with maybe 3 or 4 plugins on each one. You've got your typical routing and so-so automation going on. An M1 Pro is going to be more than fine for you. That's actually what I'm sticking with, and I have never even come close. It's never been an issue. I've kept either a 32 or a 64 buffer in everything I've done so far, and I've never needed to go off of that, and I've been able to do a ton of tracks and a ton of processing now. I don't do a ton of virtual instruments. Now, if you're a heavy hitter, a heavy user, okay, and you're doing quite a bit of virtual instruments and you're doing heavy sessions and things like that, then I'm going to say go with the M1 Max, okay? I think if you can afford to swing the money, look, if I was looking for a desktop today, I would go with the Mac Studio M1 Max. That's what I would buy. I would not consider the Ultra. No freaking way. The Mac Studio M1 Max, from memory, I think comes with a 32 gigabyte of RAM and a 1 terabyte hard drive right out of the gate before you need to even consider upgrading anything else. That's a computer you could buy right off the shelf and get going with it, okay? Again, you might want to consider, I would leave the 32 gig of RAM alone. I've got videos out there demonstrating hundreds of virtual instruments, okay, or over 100 virtual instruments. Now that was on a Mac Ultra, and so keep that in mind. But still, that's a boatload, and it didn't soak up. It never really soaked up more than 32 gigabyte of RAM. All right, so that should tell you something. You should probably go back and watch some of those videos just from the performance part. Okay. So I don't think you need to bump up to 64, but if you want to spend the money, go ahead. It's kind of a questionable thing regarding long-term. Other things may come back in and be able to take up more advantage of those things, but as it exists today, I don't think you need it, okay? I think that Mac Studio is the sweet spot. Now, if you want a laptop and you need to kind of keep your money kind of confined a little bit, then if you do video editing, do not consider the 14-inch MacBook Pro. Don't consider it, okay? You will find it quite limiting when you're doing just video editing on the go. Now, of course, when you're sit back there, you dock into a monitor. It's a non-issue. But if you're on the go, it is worth every penny to bump up to that 16 inches. It's, believe it or not, 14 to 16 is a big difference, okay? I ended up returning my 14-inch MacBook Pro and kept the 16-inch MacBook Pro, okay? But you can do great work with that. But if you're just doing audio work, I think you can be perfectly fine with that 14-inch MacBook Pro. But that, and so that's a way to go as well. All right. I have found that the M1 Pro, MacBook Pro 16-inch with a 1 terabyte hard drive and 16 gig of RAM has been perfectly fine for me. If I were doing it again, I would bump it up to probably 32 gig of RAM, although I don't think I'll personally ever push that 16 gigabyte of RAM, but I do things outside of audio too. All right, so that may become in handy at that point, but that's mostly GPU stuff I need over there, so I'm probably covered. All right, and so again, if you're a bedroom warrior, entry level, and you're not doing heavy stuff, you just want to be able to capture your stuff and not have to deal with latency, not have to deal with DSP stuff, an M1 MacBook Air, M1 Mac Mini is perfectly fine for you. You want to get into more heavier stuff, an M1 Pro, okay? Is going to do a great job for you. Again, I push mine a lot and I've never come close to it yet. If you're heavy, go with the M1 Max. I'm going to say for right now, under no circumstances, and I mean under no circumstances, if I'm primarily doing audio, would I shell out the additional $2,000 for the Ultra. I wouldn't do it. I did it and I'm sending it back. Okay. So I'm not going to keep it. Okay. I just didn't find enough performance increase from the M1 Pro to the M1 Ultra for audio work, okay? Now, it did stream my video work better, and I did like it better for video because sometimes I'll get out there and I'll have 5 or 6 4K streams at one time going, especially when I'm doing talking head stuff and I've got screenshots and I've got all these other stuff going on and I want to do my fades and everything. I'll just duplicate those within there, so I'll have a lot of that going. So I found that rendering was super fast there. and it was just a tad, it was a little bit slower than the M1 Pro, but not enough to justify the cost, all right? So I think that $2,000 sweet spot is where it's at. Now, from everything that I get, remember in the beginning, I talked about MaxTech over here on that video that I showed you before. I talked about those guys. And so ultimately, they share a lot of information. That's why I recommend you go out and watch those videos too. It's worth your time. I mean, you're making a big investment here, so invest your time into learning about it is my recommendation. But their implication is once the M2 comes out, and the next incarnation of OS X, they announced it last year. I think it's probably going to get released this year. I can't remember the name of it, but the one after Monterey. Of course, we're going to go through some growing pains with that, as you'd expect. So you want to let the dust settle on that. But that is once they do that and they have the M2 architecture, then they can truly capitalize and take full advantage of the capabilities of the Mac Studio. That's what they're saying. It's a little bit too technical. I'm a geeky guy. I'm into the technical stuff, but that's a little bit too much for me. Okay, so those are my recommendations. Now, I'm just one guy out there. I will tell you, I analyze the living crap out of this stuff, so I feel confident I'm giving you good advice, all right? So hopefully this helps you in your purchasing decision. Now, these recommendations are based upon a recording studio stuff, a home project studio, right? Not everything else, right? If you get into everything else, then it's a different discussion altogether, right? So if you like the things I talk about on this channel, on this channel, or any other channel, I'd really like you watching mine. Do me a favor, hit that like button, that subscribe button, and then that notification bell. Helps me grow the channel, okay? Believe it or not, I've only, let's see, I think I've been at this 9 months so far. I started this channel about 9 months, and it's grown pretty quickly. I've been surprised, been pleasantly surprised, and I appreciate it. Want you to know I do a lot of work to put these videos out, and if you think I'm getting rich on YouTube, you are wrong, okay? Now, it has bought me a few pieces of gear here and there, but I ain't making bank and I ain't getting rich. So I'm doing this because I really want to help. Okay. I ain't got no agenda. I'm going to tell you the real deal. Ain't working for no manufacturer. Never will. And that's all there is to it. Okay. So do me a favor. Leave me some comments down below. Tell me what you think about the subject at hand today. I appreciate that. Like the engagement. Love the interaction out there between each other and between me and you. Okay. So do me a favor and do that. But until next time, I hope every one of you have a happy computing day. Bye-bye.